The field hospital sat a few kilometers behind the front, close enough to feel the shudder of artillery, but far enough that its whitewashed walls and tents still pretended to be part of the civilian world. It occupied what had once been a provincial lycée, a modest school with tall windows, a central courtyard, and classrooms that smelled of chalk and varnish. War had scraped away its innocence. Desks had been stacked in a barn outside. Blackboards were covered not with lessons but with casualty lists and supply inventories. Where adolescents had once studied Latin and geometry, rows of iron beds now waited beneath fading maps of rivers and mountain chains. By 1916, this small hospital had become a constant presence in the life of the sector. Men arrived and departed in an unending tide. Some stayed only hours, others weeks. A few never left. The place functioned like a lung for the front, inhaling the wounded, exhaling the patched up, the permanently broken, or the dead. Its rhythms were dictated by the battles ahead of it, by the weather, by the unpredictable mood of the guns. At the center of this fragile organism moved the nurses. They came from cities and villages, from convents, from families where the idea of a woman working outside the home had once been unthinkable. Some had formal training. Others had learned quickly in the brutal classroom of necessity. Their uniforms varied, some crisp and regulation, others improvised from what materials were available. But they shared the same expression, a mix of concentration, fatigue, and a tenderness carefully disciplined so it would not break their hands. Every morning began in the half-dark, long before the first stretchers arrived. In the converted classrooms that served as wards, nurses walked between beds checking pulses, adjusting bandages, changing dressings. Lamps cast yellow pools of light onto white sheets. A low chorus of coughs, murmurs, and restless dreaming filled the air. The night shift handed over observations: who had worsened, who had stabilized, who had died quietly before dawn. The ledger of survival was updated bedside by bedside. There was a ritual to the work. Basins were filled and emptied, thermometers shaken and slid beneath tongues, bottles of disinfectant lined up like a fragile line of defense against an invisible adversary. The nurses moved with a practical grace, born of repetition. Their hands had become fluent in tasks that had once belonged to other people. Doctors, orderlies, charitable ladies doing occasional visits. War had compressed roles. The nurses bore a share of responsibility that felt both overwhelming and undeniable. Outside, the road leading from the front was never truly quiet. Ambulances rattled over ruts, their canvas sides stiff with dried mud. Horse-drawn wagons jolted the wounded in ways that made time itself seem cruel. When an offensive was underway, the stream thickened until it became a flood. The hospital's courtyard then filled rapidly, stretchers laid side by side, groans and urgent cries rising through the smell of mud, sweat, blood, and antiseptic. In those moments, the nurses had no time to think, only to act. Triage began immediately. The most gravely wounded were sorted by the barest of criteria. Who might be saved with immediate intervention? Who could wait? Who required only comfort? Decisions were sometimes made in seconds, in doorways, under the uneven light of a single lamp. The nurses learned to read faces with the accuracy of clinical instruments. The gray pallor that meant blood loss was already beyond assistance. The shallow breathing that suggested shock, the eyes already focused somewhere else. They did not speak of injustice. There was no time for philosophy. There were bandages to apply, splints to fix, fractures to stabilize. Men whose bodies had carried them across fields and through shell bursts now lay helpless, dependent on strangers for everything: water, warmth, cleanliness, the reassurance that they had not been abandoned. The nurses provided all of that and more, not because they had been taught to be heroic, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The old chemistry classroom had been transformed into an operating theater. The black-top tables were replaced by metal ones. The glass-fronted cabinets now held instruments instead of beakers. Under the harsh light of hanging lamps, surgeons worked in aprons stained from previous operations. Nurses assisted them, passing scalpels, controlling bleeding, counting sponges and instruments, with a vigilance that brooked no attention to fatigue. Their eyes learned to distinguish shades of red, to recognize when a wound was clean enough, when infection had already taken root. Between operations, they sterilized tools, boiled linens, washed floors. They learned to move from a hopeless case to a hopeful one without letting their hands tremble. In a single afternoon, a nurse might escort a man whose life had just been saved to a recovery ward, then wash the body of another for burial. Life and death brushed shoulders constantly in the narrow corridors. Beyond the operating theater lay the long classrooms turned into wards. Each still had a chalkboard, now covered with bed numbers, names, notes on condition. Above some beds, pupils' old maps remained. Europe, the world, rivers traced in fading blue. Under these maps lay the physical evidence of war's geography. Wounds from distant hills, scars from particular valleys, frostbite earned on certain stretches of frozen trench. The juxtaposition felt almost cruel. The nurses, however, had no time to reflect on the irony. Their work demanded presence, not commentary. The wounded brought bits of the front with them, mud from a particular stretch of no man's land, scraps of uniform torn by exploding shells, letters from home stained by rain and carried in pockets close to the heart. Sometimes they carried more fragile cargo, the last words of a comrade, the memory of a gesture, a half-finished joke. These fragments would be entrusted to the nurses, who acted not only as caregivers, but as messengers, scribes, witnesses. They wrote to families when men could not hold pens, explaining what the injured could not bear to put into words. They knew that every sentence would be read again and again in kitchens far away, weighed for nuance, parsed for hidden meaning. In quieter moments, on days when the front stalled or the guns fell unusually silent, the hospital itself seemed to exhale. The ward settled into a rhythm of small tasks. Sheets were changed, hair washed, beards trimmed, boots cleaned of dried mud. Men who could sit up were encouraged to read, to sew, to play cards. A few attempted to draw scenes from the front, or from their imaginations, using stubby pencils on scraps of paper. The nurses welcomed these moments, not because they offered rest, they rarely did, but because they proved that normality could be reassembled in fragments. Yet even in calm spells, the war intruded. Supply shortages meant that bandages were sometimes washed and reused despite best practice. Soap and disinfectant had to be carefully rationed. Fuel for heating was a constant concern. On cold nights, nurses added extra blankets to shivering bodies, then walked briskly between wards to keep their own blood moving. Influenza and other diseases crept through the wards like unwelcome specters. Men whose wounds had nearly healed found themselves suddenly gripped by fever. The nurses recognized the look of a body turning against itself and renewed their vigilance. Sleep was a rare and precious currency. Nurses worked shifts that blurred into each other. They grabbed rest in narrow beds in upstairs rooms or in unused corners when they could, often with uniforms still on, boots beside them ready to be pulled on at the first call. Their dreams, when they came, were restless collections of images, a dressing that would not stay in place, a face they could not quite recall, a corridor that never ended. They woke as tired as when they had lain down, but they got up anyway. The men in the wards had no choice, neither did they. When casualties surged, every rule and schedule dissolved. Meals were eaten standing up, if at all. Coffee and tea became lifelines, the bitter taste barely noticed. The nurses' hands blistered under constant washing in cold water. Their skin cracked from soaps meant to strip away invisible threats. Yet they continued. Their movements almost mechanical, but their attention always specific. This man needed his morphine dose adjusted. That one had not eaten all day. Another's bandage needed changing sooner than scheduled. They carried in their minds a mental map of the ward far more detailed than any doctor's chart. They knew which patient had a small child waiting for him, which one feared the dark, which one could not bear the sound of distant shellfire, which one had nightmares so severe he thrashed in his sleep and risked reopening wounds. They adjusted routines accordingly, dimming lamps, arranging beds, coordinating with other nurses to ensure that someone was always nearby when certain men slept. Many of them had not imagined this life before the war. Some had been in training, others had been teachers, shopkeepers' daughters, factory workers. The war opened a door they had not known existed, ushering them into a profession that demanded more than anyone had warned them it would: more stamina, more resilience, more emotional discipline. Yet it also gave them a sense of purpose they had rarely encountered in civilian life. They belonged to something that mattered intensely, even if that something was born of catastrophe. The community within the hospital developed its own quiet culture. Nurses supported each other in ways small and large. A cup of hot drink handed over at the end of a long shift. A few minutes of conversation on a staircase landing. A shared look across a ward when a patient took a turn for the better or worse. These gestures stitched together their own fraying strength. They did not have the luxury of collapsing. Their collapse would ripple outward, adding weight to men already heavily burdened. Death was an inevitable presence, but the nurses worked to soften its arrival. They straightened sheets, closed eyes, smoothed hair. Some placed small tokens, a photograph, a medal, a letter, on the pillow beside the still face before the orderlies came with the stretcher. They documented the basics: time, cause, personal effects. When possible, they took a moment to remember something specific about the person who had just ceased to be a patient: his laugh, his shy politeness, his stubborn refusal to complain. These private acts of acknowledgement were a form of resistance against the anonymizing force of war. In the hospital's small courtyard, A section had been set aside for fresh air and sun. When weather allowed, those strong enough were wheeled out or helped to walk there. Nurses escorted them, adjusting blankets against unexpected breezes. In this space, the war felt temporarily distant. The men tilted their heads back to feel sunlight on their faces, watching clouds move in an unhurried sky. To them, the nurses must have seemed eternal, figures always in motion, always near, replacing fear with instructions, discomfort with practical interventions. Yet, the nurses themselves were often deeply affected by what they witnessed. Some wrote diaries late at night, chronicling their days in careful handwriting. Their entries rarely indulged in sentimentality. Instead, they listed tasks, cases, impressions. The emotional weight seeped through between the lines, the mention of a particular patient several nights in a row, the description of a new batch of wounded arriving with injuries worse than any seen before, the brief note about a letter from home that had brought a moment of warmth. They were not immune to the war's strain. Some fell ill from overwork or infection. A few had to be sent away to recover. Their absence felt keenly by colleagues. When they returned, thinner and paler, they slipped back into the rhythm as if they had never left. The work did not pause for anyone. There were always more men to care for, more dressings to change, more temperatures to record. The hospital had a chapel, modest and worn, where nurses sometimes went between shifts. They did not always go to pray. Sometimes they just needed a quiet space that was not a ward or an office, a place where the air did not smell of antiseptic and sweat. The simple wooden benches and stained glass windows offered a different kind of order than the medical one. Here, they could acknowledge the grief they had no time to express elsewhere. Tears shed in that small room were private, quickly dried. Outside, another convoy of ambulances might already be turning in through the gate. As months became years, the hospital bore the marks of time. Floors scuffed by countless boots, doorways chipped by stretchers, walls discolored where oxygen cylinders had bumped against them. The nurses, too, bore marks not immediately visible. Persistent exhaustion, moments of numbness, a sense of detachment that sometimes protected them and sometimes frightened them. They worried about what kind of life would be possible after this, whether normal tasks would ever feel meaningful again. Yet they continued to adapt. New treatments appeared, better antiseptics, improved surgical techniques, procedures refined by bitter experience. The nurses absorbed each change, incorporating new methods into their routines. They became conduits through which medical knowledge flowed from textbooks and conferences into living practice. Their work shortened recovery times, prevented infections, saved limbs and lives that would once have been deemed beyond help. They rarely received public recognition. Newspapers praised generals and decorated officers. Posters showed brave soldiers going over the top. The world beyond the front understood nursing in broad, sentimental terms. Angels of mercy, embodiments of sacrifice. These clichés failed to capture the reality of the work, which was more prosaic and more profound. Lifting, washing, measuring, recording, cleaning, listening. The nurses themselves had little energy to consider how they were perceived. Any spare thought was quickly claimed by the immediate needs around them. In the final year of the war, when rumors of possible armistice began to circulate, the mood in the hospital remained cautious. Nurses had learned that expectations could be dangerous. They had seen too many last pushes, too many offensives described as decisive, too many dates whispered as hopeful deadlines for an end that kept receding. They continued as before, tending to the wounded who arrived with the same frequency, the same combination of fear and relief at having left the front. When the announcement finally came, it did not change the hospital overnight. Men wounded on the last days of fighting still needed care. Diseases did not cease to spread because the guns had fallen silent. For weeks, the work persisted much as it had before, just without the ominous punctuation of distant explosions. Only gradually did the tone shift. Fewer new patients arrived. Some beds remained empty for longer than expected. The wards grew quieter, not because death had increased, but because suffering had stopped being replenished. The nurses began discharging men not back to the front, but back to whatever remained of their homes. The word home took on a new texture, fragile and uncertain. The nurses helped men dress in clothes that did not quite fit, sorted their modest belongings, and watched them shuffle out through doors they themselves would one day walk through for the last time. The hospital began to deconstruct itself. Extra beds were removed. Supply depots were reorganized. Some staff received orders to transfer to other facilities, to care for those slowly returning from prisoner of war camps, or those whose recovery would take years. The nurses packed their few personal items, photographs, letters, a book, a rosary, a notebook, into small bags. They walked one last time through the wards, noting the scuff marks, the familiar creak of a particular floorboard, the window where the afternoon light always fell just so. They left behind not only a building, but a part of themselves. The hospital had been their world, a place where their skills, compassion, and endurance had found constant demand. They knew they would never entirely leave it. The memories of faces, hands, voices, the weight of a body being lifted, the first clear breath taken after surgery, the quiet after a final exhalation, would travel with them into whatever peacetime offered. When the school finally resumed its original function and children returned to sit at desks in those classrooms, few of them would fully understand what had transpired there. They would trace lines on maps, conjugate verbs, solve equations. Under their feet, the floorboards would carry invisible stories. Where nurses once stood to change bandages, where a bed had been placed against that wall, where a lamp had cast its circle of light onto a face, hovering between life and death. The nurses dispersed. Some returned to families and lives that could not easily accommodate what they had become. Others remained in medical work, their wartime experience turning into the foundation of a profession that would never again be regarded as simple charity. All of them carried an altered understanding of what it meant to care for another human being. In the great inventories of the First World War, lists of battles, treaties, casualties, and costs, this small field hospital occupied no special place. It was one among thousands, yet within its walls, day after day, year after year, a different kind of struggle had taken place, a refusal to let destruction be the only story. The nurses had stood at the edge of humanity's darkest experiment and insisted that tenderness still had work to do. Their hands, cracked by cold and disinfectant, had lifted, cleaned, steadied, soothed. They had witnessed the worst that war could do and responded with the best that ordinary people could manage. Long after statistics faded and parades dissolved, that quiet, persistent labor remained, not as legend, but as legacy.